final interview with the CEO, and he asked me, if you get this job, what's going to be your biggest challenge? And I said, you will be, Mr. CEO, because I understand that you have this habit of changing the roadmap, coming up with these great ideas every 5 minutes, then changing your mind. And he assured me that would not happen. Now he had someone in the product management role. Sure enough, 6 months later, he was chopping and changing. No, add this. He never wanted to take anything off.
Welcome to the Talking Roadmaps channel. My name's Justin Woods and I'm one of the co-hosts here. And today I'm joined by Dave Barker. Dave, welcome. Introduce yourself, please.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Justin. Yes, I'm a veteran of the enterprise software space, having spent more than 40 years in many roles, both as a individual contributor and a leader. Applications like some may remember back in the 1980s, we had MRP, then ERP, human capital management, payroll, those kinds of things. And I say in many different roles, not just as a product manager, but in implementation, pre-sales, marketing, and so on. Yeah, so I've often been part of the European expansion of North American companies, so helping to get them going in various roles. I spent 5 years in the US, which was definitely useful experience. So now I'm an independent consultant with a focus on localization.
If you're enjoying the channel, subscribe, hit the bell icon and give us a like. Well, I'm really excited to dig into that with you because I think there's some really interesting aspects that we probably haven't covered on the show. And talking of the show, I should probably introduce us. So welcome to the Talking Roadmaps channel. We're the podcast on the YouTube channel where we talk all things roadmap with special guests such as Dave around practitioners, tooling experts, and some of the industry well-known names that you know and love as well. Why don't we get stuck in maybe with kind of one of the first questions, which is, from your perspective, and I know you've come at this from different angles, what's the purpose of a roadmap, do you think?
Fundamentally, it's a communication tool from the product team to others, typically internal within the company, to let them know what product's doing, simply put.
Yeah, absolutely. And so letting people know, who do you think we need to let know? What's the audience of a roadmap?
I think the audience is very broad. And I know on previous editions of the show, talked a lot about what sales are looking for, what marketing are looking for. But perhaps some other examples. For example, I once ran the proposal writing team for an enterprise company. So our role was principally responding to RFPs. And there's always a question in every RFP, please attach your roadmap. Now, we would never do that because you don't too often, just as you're about to sign the contract, the customer says, right, we want your proposal to be part of the contract. So what I was looking for out of the roadmap there was the story. What is the direction of travel? What's the thinking, the strategy behind what's going on in the product? So some text to include in the proposal to our prospective customers. So that was important there. Another example was in the role of competitive intelligence, when you're trying to help your sales organization to understand where your competitive advantages are and where your weaknesses are. And again, having an understanding of what's on the roadmap can help how you address those competitive differences. If there's something on the roadmap that's coming reasonably certainly, you can use that as ammunition against the competition. Whereas if there's it's not mentioned, then again, that's useful to know because you can find other ways as a competitive intelligence professional to deflect the competitive feature or capability that the competition have got. And then I guess the other one I'll perhaps mention is in a implementation role. As I say, a lot of my experience has been in the large global business application space where typically you might be implementing a program across 20, 30, 40 countries across 5 years. So as you plan that program with your customer, and this is where we get into the localization and internationalization, you need to understand when certain countries would be available that you can plan into your program. So again, as an implementation professional, that's where the roadmap comes in.
Yeah, very much so. I think there's some important things that we're going to go down a little bit deeper into later around the fact that when we're talking about localizations or differences there, traditionally we're having to think about quite big changes, but also very specific to different markets, different legal criteria, different regulatory criteria even. And also they might have very long time frames here because it needs a hell of a lot of planning in order to be able to think about these. That's quite complex and something that there's a lot of moving parts there. You also mentioned around it being, a story and a direction of travel. I find it interesting around, almost as a sales tool heavily when you're doing the RFP process, because your prospective clients want to know what you've got planned, but how do you provide that with some level of kind of, here's the things we're thinking of doing without specifically tying yourself down to dates and timeframes that actually you might not want to commit to as part of getting that deal.
Typically at the proposal stage, you probably haven't got the specifics of any gaps between your product today and the so it's actually quite easy to use that general textual information about what the direction of travel and so on. Typically it's later in the sales cycle when a sales team typically you find a gap between what the customer says they need and what you've got today, and that's when they start nagging the product team button down a date for this particular feature.
I've got a question here, and I want us to think about especially the localization challenges of this, which is who owns a roadmap? And that can be difficult if you've got a central team that owns the main code base and you've got regional extensions of that. How does that work? Who owns that roadmap?
I think that's changing. So certainly when I started, you had this, and I think you said it's the same thing, Del, you have the central code base, and then you have a separate code base for localization. At one point in my life, I was running the localization team for an MRP company based in the Netherlands. So we would take the code from headquarters, and it was our job to produce a European version or versions. So in that case, we kind of owned it. Now I think increasingly with modern software development techniques, modern translation tools, continuous translation, etc., then you've got one common code base. But typically in a big enterprise software company, you've got multiple development teams anyway. And so it's the old problem of exactly who owns which piece of the roadmap. Is there a separate localization team, or is it part of everybody's role to do their bit towards delivering a suitable product for a particular location?
Even if there was a global code base, and it was truly a global code base, do you think there's still importance to have regional ownership and management of that? Because the global code base predominantly, like you said, is normally in America. Is it really important, though, to still have representation and ownership of those items at a regional level, even if the code base isn't?
Yes, definitely. And I think a distributed product management team is really important, because the nuances of localization are really tricky. And even if you're a regional product manager, let's say for Europe, even then you're going to have to rely on people in country, because you can't possibly understand all the nuances of every country that you may be targeting. So yeah, definitely a global team with local representation and some kind of local ownership. But often that can be a challenge. So particularly if the development team are centralized somewhere, getting your voice heard from a regional perspective. I've certainly faced, as a regional product director, I certainly suffered from that sometimes, was trying to convince the rest of the organization of the amount and the importance of the work that was needed to be successful in other markets.
Totally, because you're almost having to create or come up with your own justifications for it, your own mini business cases sometimes of this, because you're competing with potentially other regions as to why we need to make certain changes within certain timeframes of that global code base. It's a discipline of product management that's quite specific but fascinating.
And I think it also ties into this business of localization being much more than translation, but also I think too many people that might be making the decisions about moving into additional markets don't understand. So you're right, it's that justification of all the work that needs to be done, actually not just by product and development, but by other parts of the organisation as well, to be successful in new markets.
Yes, absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about the relationship maybe of the roadmap to things like vision, strategy, objectives. How have you seen that? And again, we might maybe step back a little bit and think a bit about more your experience of the past in different roles.
Yeah, obviously, ideally, it should be an accurate reflection of the corporate strategy. Unfortunately, I've seen in a lot of companies a disconnect or no clear strategy at the corporate level. And so as a product level, you try and come up with your own strategy, and obviously you make sure your roadmap aligns with that. But it can be a struggle when there's no clear strategy at the corporate level. And again, that can sometimes be a challenge in the bigger multinational companies. When sometimes, if you've got a software company headquartered in North America, typically the North American market itself can be bigger than the whole of the rest of the world put together. So trying to get the attention of the executives to understand the complexities and the costs of globalization. Yet the interesting thing is many of those big North American customers actually are only your customers because of your commitment to the rest of the world. So I've done a lot of work in things like human capital management. So you may have 50,000 employees in North America and another 10,000 spread across 30 countries elsewhere in the world. And often the vendor's value proposition is one system globally, but the actual revenue direct revenue you're getting from those 30 extra countries is very, very small compared to North America. But you wouldn't have the North American revenue if you didn't have the capability elsewhere. And it's so particularly depending on how the company is structured, in terms of regionalization outside products, that can be interesting as well.
What about the relationship of a roadmap to other artifacts? And I'm going to unpack this a little bit. You mentioned around the roadmap and tying into strategy, and sometimes that strategy doesn't exist. And I've certainly found that as well. I've brought in some tools before to create a strategy for my own product team, but didn't have a clear company strategy to tie into. What artifacts have you seen that the roadmap might sort of relate out to that is important? Maybe even the business cases that we were talking about at the regional level. What's been important for you for your roadmap to tie into for that justification?
So in particular in the context of kind of globalization, then it needs to tie into the business plans of the business of either just being able to deliver to global customers or even to go direct selling or even indirect selling into a new region. So again, the roadmap needs to be aligned with that. If you're planning on opening an office in Germany in 2025, then you need to have a product for that market in 2025. And again, this comes back to if you're planning on opening up in a new country, that doesn't happen overnight. You've got to plan that. So again, the long lead time on the product as well. But you need that visibility of you need to be able to deliver something a year out. When, as professionals, of course, we don't like to commit anything beyond the next sprint or the next quarter, maybe. So.
It's a much bigger world when you're thinking about opening, offices to support, and you need regional extensions to support that. It's a much longer roadmap and probably actually a completely different level. So at that level, Dave, what do you believe are the key elements or content that you'd want to see maybe at a roadmap of that level? What would you expect to see on that?
What you need to see is that this country or this market in a particular time frame, and probably not going into the detail, but that's the catch. In the world of business software, to be usable in a country, you've actually got to have a complete product in the sense it must be compliant. So it's got to satisfy all the legal rules, all the security and privacy rules. It's not like you can't deliver an MVP. It's what I sometimes call an MCP, a minimum compliant product, which is pretty much a complete product. And again, that kind of goes against the philosophy of some of our ideas of modern product management. So I think on the roadmap, as I say, you just need to know that country in that time frame. But behind that, there needs to be the assumption that it will be a complete product in the sense that it's compliant.
Interesting. So it's much, much higher level. And it's actually that we can't really test and learn in some of these cases. We can't put an MVP out that might satisfy the software requirements, but completely contradict legal and mandatory, which then puts us in trouble or hot water, or means we can't even go live at all. The minimal compliant product is a new term for me, but actually completely makes sense, which is we need to go live with the robustness that means that we can sustain this. We can't just test and iterate on a very small scale. It must meet the needs of that locality, and then we can go from there.
And also the other factor of these, my experience, as I say, has been in these big enterprise type software. it's not that you can implement the product over the weekend. These are typically 6 to 9 month implementations. So you've been, even if you don't have the software right at the beginning of the implementation, you've probably been using the software for 6 months before you go live and really find out whether it's good or not, by which time so much time has passed. It's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. So when we talk about that longer term roadmap, how would you prefer to visualize that? I think in that instance, dates are probably important. So what would you expect to visualize or put on that roadmap?
Well, it's a good opportunity actually to be quite colourful. I've seen the way basically just used a flag of the country and the name on a possibly by region, by quarter or by half year out for a couple of years, saying this is our product. Maybe depending on the nature of your product, if you're a multi-product company, then obviously you need to identify which of the products would be available then. And some might not be. And again, I've seen that miscommunicated where people have assumed that actually all the functionality that's available in the home country would be available in the foreign country. But in fact, the product team's goal was actually only to make some subset of that still have a compliant product, but not as much scope as in the home country. So again, that's important to communicate that.
Dave, that makes a lot of sense because actually there's so much more that goes on with these different countries. Currencies is a classic one. The native language and then the other languages that might be spoken are other ones. So there's so much complexity there. So I love the fact that the visualization could be flags of the country, maybe something that denotes the language or the currencies there as well. I think we've got an opportunity to be playful with roadmaps and actually add some interest there to, as you said, tell that story and direction of travel. Dave, what tools do you prefer for managing a roadmap?
So I think in terms of managing it internally, then there's a number of tools. In the past I've used things like AHA and this, that, and the other. But I think in terms of the presentation, I know this is not a popular answer, but PowerPoint or similar, because you want to be able to include a lot of text. You want that story up front of the strategy and whatever. And I just think that the mechanical tools, as I like to call them, they're good for listing this, that, and the other, or maybe plotting stuff out in a way. But given you want your roadmap to be reasonably high level, not too much detail, then PowerPoint is just as good as anything else.
I totally agree, actually. And that might be controversial from my tooling background as well. But I think, like you said, the mechanical tools, the management of the roadmap ultimately has to be done somewhere else where it can manage the moving parts, the complexities, the timelines and things like that. But when it comes to the presentation, I think modern tools now, Miro, Mural, online collaboration tools, your PowerPoint. I mean, PowerPoint is ubiquitous and it's always typically available for the companies or something similar in terms of a presentation tool. And it gives you that flexibility. I think it also allows you to stylize the roadmap in any way that you want that might be meaningful. And so that's part of the joy of road mapping is not just the story arc of what it is that we're building and why, but it's bringing some color and some interest to that to help tell that story. So I think I understand what you're saying. There's lots of tools out there, but PowerPoint and these presentation tools give us the ultimate in flexibility. I think what I'd also add to that is that the introduction of product management tools is really fairly recent in the last 10, 15 years or so. And so, but product road mapping is a discipline that's gone way back, whether we called it product management or not. And so looking at that, there will have been tools that we used at the time that just, that existed then. And none of the product management tools that we really are able to leverage now actually existed.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, we've certainly come a long way there.
Dave, what do you consider to be a best practice in road mapping? And this can again be from some roadmaps that you've created or roadmaps that you've been a recipient of. What have been some of the best practices that you've seen?
I think absolutely what I call telling the story, at least as you introduce the roadmap itself, make it very clear what the strategy is, what the thinking behind the roadmap is, and then and then not jumping straight into we're going to have this feature on that date, whatever. It's keeping it as high level as you can for the audience, but communicating the background. In an ideal, I've worked in some companies where we were small enough that we kind of kept control of the roadmap, and it was one of the product management team that would always present the roadmap to anybody, rather than just posting it on a SharePoint site somewhere. But if if you have got a big organisation, you do need to communicate that way. It's really important that the thinking is clearly demonstrated there, as well as the facts, the capabilities that you're looking at, etc. And any dates, alternative dates that are included.
Yeah, indeed. And so the kind of conversely, what are some of the biggest mistakes you think people make in road mapping? And this might be an interesting of maybe even attaching the roadmap to the RFP. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen?
So actually, one of the, I was thinking about this. One of the interesting, it's what I call bullying by the chief executive or the senior executives. I remember once when I'd interviewed for the job of head of product at a company, having talks to most of the management team, the final interview with the CEO, and he asked me, if you get this job, what's going to be your biggest challenge? And I said, you will be, Mr. CEO, because I understand that you have this habit of changing the roadmap, coming up with these great ideas every 5 minutes, and then changing your mind. And he assured me that would not happen. Now he had someone in the product management role. Sure enough, 6 months later, he was chopping and changing. No, add this. He never wanted to take anything off. He always wanted to add it. And more recently, I've seen this before, that a product team was in effect bullied into including things on the roadmap that, in reality, they had no hope of delivering in the timeline. So other constituencies had their hopes raised that something was coming, and in reality, it never would have done. So better to have pushed back if you can in the first place. But depending on how the organisation is structured, you can't always, as a product team, you can't always push back.
Yeah, very true. It often depends. In that scenario, I think it's always challenging when the first person comes in a product management role to almost take that over from the CEO. Is for the CEO to go, okay, someone that is now in control, and often they will feel very challenged. It will be very difficult for them to let go of that, and so I think we see that. That's certainly a big one that I've seen before.
And that could particularly be a problem if the CEO is the founder and he founded it as a product person, then getting them to let go of the reins is quite a challenge.
I'm wondering if there was anything that we've talked about so far, or maybe haven't talked about, that you'd like to bring to the surface. Was there anything that comes to mind that you kind of like to delve deeper into?
Yeah, perhaps a couple more of the kind of going back to localization, globalization, and some of the, you've already mentioned some of the things, obviously language, business requirements, but increasingly topics like privacy and security are becoming more and more of an issue around the world. Individual governments identifying, implementing new privacy rules, new security rules, which you have to be compliant with. A big challenge in the world of SaaS, of course, is the fact that the SaaS model was built on one instance of the software running in one place and everybody accessing it from there. But increasingly, governments are implementing laws that say, personal financial data cannot be kept anywhere. There's always been this tension between Europe and the US over this. But countries like Saudi Arabia now mandating that all personal data must be hosted within the country, which again kind of really attacks the roots of the SaaS model if you've actually got to have multiple instances by country. And other things like geopolitics, not something that we always think of to start with, but I was always fascinated a couple of occasions over the last few years. Some people might remember, I think it was at the last Olympic Games, then it's the Beijing Olympics, one of the TV channels in North America put up a map of the area around China and immediately got into trouble because it did not reflect China's claims to a large part of the South China Sea. And then the opposite happened, I think it was when, not a topic I'm particularly interested in, but when the Barbie film was launched, in one of the promo videos that was aired in Thailand, again, there's this map apparently in the Barbie movie. It's not a real map, but it looks a bit like the area around the South China Sea. And I think this did have what appeared to be a dotted line showing China's claims to territory. And the Vietnamese got upset for the opposite version. And I think, again, in our world of software, we need to be careful about this, that if you are representing information or data about countries that is controversial, you can get yourself into trouble if you're not careful. So it's another thing to think about as a product manager when you're dealing with localization, globalization.
It really does, and like we said at the beginning of the show, it's so much more than just that language and the complexities. Once you dig down into it, you can see why for some products or for some companies, the regional product manager is a full-time job, or even multiple people, in order to be able to manage all of those things from a product management perspective, let alone a development and an implementation and a rollout perspective as well. Amazing. So Dave, I'm going to ask you the hard question now, which is, if you could distill your philosophy of road mapping into a couple of sentences, how would you describe it?
This may not go down well with your audience, but I guess my philosophy is there's no easy answer. Having sat on both sides of the fence, building roadmaps as a product person and consuming roadmaps in various other roles, there's a constant tension between the two needs. And I don't think there's an easy answer. At the heart of it, it has to be communication. That's what a roadmap is all about. And in particular, the roadmap will change. I think when the roadmap changes, it needs to be communicated. To whoever's got hold of the original roadmap needs to know about the changes as soon as possible. So that any resetting of expectations can happen as soon as possible. I
think that's absolutely the point. Is it shouldn't be this is the roadmap, this is what we're building. I know that often when you read it like that, it can be seen in that way. But actually, it's a starting point of a conversation. It's to make sure that we communicate what we want to do and to make sure we have alignment on that. And some people might not align, and so the roadmap there is really to instigate those conversations rather than to necessarily say this is what you're getting and that's the end of it. So I think, as you mentioned there, that communication is so important. And Dave, I know you've sat many sides of the table in your career too around that roadmap.
Yeah, I saw a roadmap recently which quite clearly stated in a sentence at the bottom, for the second half of this year, this is aspirational and not a commitment. But I know very well that a lot of people that saw that chose not to read or understand that line. They saw the pretty picture above that said, this country's coming in the second half of this year, and they've gone and planned accordingly. But there's every chance it won't happen.
Totally. All that disclaimer gets conveniently snipped off the bottom and then shared with sales or as part of an RFP, and we're into hot water. Well, Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today. Thank you for bringing some awareness of the complexities and nuances to product management from a regional perspective, and in fact products from a regional perspective as well. A lot of things that maybe our traditional audience wouldn't have considered or realised is going on. You play a really important part these days now as an independent consultant, helping companies, not just in a product management role, but in many. I wanted to give you an opportunity to pitch your offering and share with people what you do and how they can find you.
Sure, thanks, Justin. Yes. So as you say, independent consultant, but using my many years' experience, a lot of that in helping companies enter Europe, software companies into Europe, then offering consulting to product managers and others how best to do it. One of my kind of prepackaged offerings is a localization readiness assessment, being able to take a look at the product and the product team, identify how ready they are, what experience they've got, any things they may not have thought about, and then leading on from that, help put together that justification, that business plan. So people can find me on LinkedIn, Dave Barker, and I've also got a website, antoinebarker.com. So happy to talk to anyone who'd like to discuss more.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure that we put those down below in the YouTube video. If you're listening on a podcast somewhere, feel free to go to talkingroadmaps.com and we'll have some of that down in the description as well. But all that leaves me to say is, Dave, thank you so much for chatting with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Yep. Justin, thank you very much indeed as well. Thank you.